In the glittering skyline of Boston, where ancient brick buildings stand shoulder to shoulder with glass skyscrapers, Maxwell Grant's penthouse overlooked the city like a modern-day castle. The 45-year-old venture capitalist moved through, his morning routine with practiced precision, his Italian leather shoes clicking against marble floors as the sunrise painted his empty kingdom in hues of gold. Another day, another deal, Maxwell muttered to his reflection in the bathroom mirror, straightening his perfectly knotted tie. His face, though handsome, carried the tight lines of someone who had forgotten how to truly smile. The phone rang. His assistant's voice filtered through the speaker. "Mr. Grant, your 8 a.m. with Horizon Tech is confirmed, followed by lunch with the board at Elliott's. The Richardson contract is ready for signing, and your mother called again about Sunday dinner. Tell her I'm flying to Chicago," Maxwell replied without hesitation, the lie coming easily after years of practice. "And move the Richardson signing to tomorrow. I want to review the terms one more time." As his private elevator descended 80 floors, Maxwell scrolled through emails, arranged in order of financial importance. His empire had grown exponentially over the past decade. Tech startups, real estate developments, a chain of luxury hotels spanning 3 continents. Forbes had featured him last month, the man with the golden touch. The article failed to mention the emptiness that followed him like a shadow, the restless nights, the 3 failed relationships, the prescription bottles in his medicine cabinet. Outside, his driver held the door of a gleaming black Bentley. "Good morning, Mr. Grant." "Morning, Charles." Maxwell slid into the back seat without looking up from his phone. The morning meetings blurred together, projections, acquisitions, terminations. By noon, he had authorized the layoff of 300 employees from a recently acquired software company and invested $20 million in a promising cryptocurrency platform. Success had become a simple equation: maximize profit, minimize risk, ignore consequence. Lunch at Elliott's was a performance. Maxwell smiled at the right moments, laughed at insider jokes, and proposed a toast to another record quarter. Inside, a familiar numbness spread through his chest. These men and women around the mahogany table weren't friends. They were strategic alliances, temporary partnerships, until a better opportunity arose. "You seem distracted today, Max," observed Victoria Winters, the sleek investment banker whose tactical brilliance matched his own. Her eyes, calculating and sharp, reminded him of his ex-wife. "Just considering our next move," he deflected, signaling the waiter for another scotch. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered over Boston, bringing an unseasonable chill for May. As the meeting at Cartwright Industries concluded, Maxwell declined the executive car service, surprising even himself. "I'll walk, clear my head," he told his assistant over the phone. "Have the contract sent to my home office." The rain began suddenly, a deluge that soaked through his $3,000 suit within minutes. Other pedestrians scattered for shelter, but Maxwell continued walking, feeling something close to relief as the cold water washed over him. 10 blocks from Cartwright Industries, the heaviness in his chest became unbearable. He sat down heavily on a bench, barely noticing the modest apartment buildings that lined this unfamiliar neighborhood. "You look like you could use this more than me." Maxwell looked up to see a woman in her 30s standing before him, holding out an umbrella. Her scrubs peeked out from beneath a worn raincoat, and exhaustion lined her face. Yet there was something in her eyes, a warmth that seemed out of place in this cold, wet world. "I'm fine," he managed, water streaming down his face. "No offense, but you don't look fine," she persisted, with a directness that caught him off guard. "And that bench belongs to Mrs. Abernathy in 3B, who'll have my head if I let someone catch pneumonia on it. I'm Sarah Parker, by the way." "Maxwell Grant," he replied automatically, accepting the umbrella more out of surprise than need. "Well, Maxwell Grant, there's a diner around the corner that makes the best coffee in Boston. And since you're already soaked through, another 5 minutes won't make much difference." Before he could form a logical objection, Sarah was walking away, clearly expecting him to follow, and strangely, inexplicably, he did. The diner was a boudoir. Far cry from his usual establishments, formica tables, vinyl booths, and waitresses who called everyone honey. Sarah ordered for both of them, and soon a steaming mug of black coffee sat before him. "So, what brings a man in $1,000 shoes to Riverside in the pouring rain?" she asked, stirring cream into her own. "Cab?" "Just walking," he said, uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "Nobody just walks in this weather. You're either running from something or towards something." A strange prickle ran down Maxwell's spine. "Do you psychoanalyze all strangers? You rescue from park benches?" "Only the ones who look like they need it," she countered with a smile that transformed her tired face. "I'm a nurse at Boston General, acute care geriatrics. I've gotten pretty good at reading people." The conversation shifted to her work, and Maxwell found himself listening, truly listening, for the first time in months. Sarah spoke of her elderly patients with genuine affection, describing their struggles and triumphs with a respect that made them individuals, not statistics. "They've lived such incredible lives," she was saying. "Mr. Rodriguez fought in Korea, Mrs. Klein escaped Nazi Germany as a child, and Mrs. Wilson, she helped design rocket components for NASA in the 60s. As she spoke, Maxwell noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the mended cuff of her raincoat, the cheap digital watch on her wrist. Yet there was nothing in her manner that suggested discontent or envy. "Don't you ever get tired of it?" he asked suddenly. "The endless needs, the minimal recognition, He gestured vaguely. "Constraints." Something flickered in her eyes, not offense but understanding. "Some days are harder than others," she admitted, "but purpose isn't the same as profit, Mr. Grant." The statement hit him with unexpected force, as if she had reached across the table and struck him. Before he could respond, her phone buzzed. "That's my reminder. I need to get home. My mother needs her medication." She stood, leaving money for both their coffees despite his protest. "Keep the umbrella, looks like the rain isn't letting up." As she turned to leave, a strange urgency gripped Maxwell. "Sarah," she paused, looking back. "Thank you," he said, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "For the coffee." "Any time," she replied with a smile, and then she was gone, hurrying through the rain toward home. That night in his vast penthouse, Maxwell stood at the window watching lightning streak across the Boston sky. The umbrella, a cheap collapsible thing with a chipped handle, sat on his imported marble counter like a foreign object. He should have left it at the diner. He should have never followed her at all. Yet as he finally drifted towards sleep, it was Sarah's words that echoed in his mind. Purpose isn't the same as profit. And for the first time in years, Maxwell Grant dreamed, not of acquisitions or losses, but of rain-soaked benches and coffee served in chipped mugs. 3 days had passed since the rainy encounter, yet Maxwell couldn't shake the memory of Sarah Parker from his thoughts. During board meetings, conference calls, and investment reviews, her words kept surfacing in his mind like persistent bubbles in still water. Purpose isn't the same as profit. "Mr. Grant, did you hear the question?" Victoria Winter's sharp voice cut through his distraction. The boardroom of Grant Ventures fell silent, 12 executives waiting for his response. "Repeat it," Maxwell commanded, his tone leaving no room for comments on his lapse in attention. Later that afternoon, he found himself in his private office, a glass sanctuary 40 floors above Boston's financial district. He should have been reviewing acquisition projections for a promising healthcare startup. Instead, he was searching online for Sarah Parker Nurse Boston General. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, closing the browser window. He was Maxwell Grant. He didn't obsess over chance encounters with working-class women in diners. Yet that evening, instead of attending the charity gala he'd paid $10,000 per plate to sponsor, Maxwell found himself driving his rarely used Aston Martin toward Boston General Hospital. He parked across the street, feeling both foolish and strangely determined as he watched the evening shift change. It was nearly midnight when he spotted her. Sarah emerged from the hospital's side entrance, her hair now loose around her shoulders, exchanging goodbyes with colleagues. Without conscious decision, Maxwell stepped out of his car. "Stalking is generally frowned upon in Massachusetts," Sarah called out as she approached, though her tone was more amused than alarmed. even when done in vehicles worth more than my entire apartment building. Maxwell felt heat rise to his face, an unfamiliar sensation. I was driving by, he lied. At midnight? Past a hospital that's nowhere near your part of town? Her eyebrow raised in skepticism. I Googled you, Maxwell Grant. Your face is all over the financial pages. I wanted to return your umbrella, he said, though he'd left it sitting in his penthouse. Sarah laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to brighten the dim parking lot. You're a terrible liar for a businessman. Come on, there's an all-night cafe down the block. I could use some caffeine before my bus. The cafe was even more modest than the diner, fluorescent lighting, scratched tables, a tired server who barely looked up from her phone. Yet as they settled into a corner booth, Maxwell felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Rough shift? He asked, noticing the weariness in her eyes. Lost a patient today. Mrs. Wilson, the NASA lady I told you about. Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. She didn't have family. I was holding her hand when she went. The raw honesty in her voice struck Maxwell. In his world, failures and losses were buried beneath legal terminology and PR statements. Sorry, he offered, knowing the inadequacy of the words. It's part of the job, she said simply, but it never gets easier. Every single one matters. She looked up at him. What about you? What constitutes a bad day in your world? The question caught him off guard. Market downturns, failed acquisitions, competitors gaining ground. And how many people are affected when you have a bad day? Hundreds, sometimes thousands, he answered, thinking of stock prices and investor confidence. No, I mean really affected. Do you know their names, their stories? Do you hold their hands when they're afraid? The question hung between them, and Maxwell found himself unable to meet her gaze. I didn't come here to be lectured on corporate ethics, he said stiffly. I'm not lecturing, I'm curious. She leaned forward. A man worth what? $500 million? Doesn't drive to a hospital at midnight to return an umbrella he doesn't have. So why are you really here, Maxwell Grant? The directness of her question pierced through his well-constructed defenses. I don't know, he admitted, the honesty surprising even himself. I haven't been able to stop thinking about what you said, about purpose and profit. Something. In Sarah's expression softened. Now that's an honest answer. Their conversation shifted, flowing more easily as Sarah spoke about her life, growing up in a small town in western Massachusetts, putting herself through nursing school, moving to Boston to care for her mother after her stroke. Mom was an elementary school teacher for 30 years, she explained. She put everything into her students. When she got sick, I couldn't bear the thought of her in some facility. So I moved her in with me, took the job at Boston General. That's a significant sacrifice, Maxwell observed. Sarah shrugged. It's what you do for family. Mom gave up everything for me when Dad left. It's just how it works. As she spoke, Maxwell noticed a small tarnished locket around her neck, a stark contrast to the diamonds and platinum that adorned the women in his social circle. Family heirloom, he asked, gesturing to the necklace. Sarah's hand went to it automatically, a gentle touch that spoke of deep affection. Mom gave it to me when I graduated nursing school. It was her mother's. My grandmother worked as a maid for a wealthy family in Newport. The wife gave it to her after she helped deliver their child during a blizzard. She smiled softly. Inside is a tiny photograph of my grandmother and my mother as a baby. Maxwell felt a strange tightness in his chest. His own family heirlooms were locked in safety deposit boxes or displayed in museum-like rooms in his various properties. Valuable, but meaningless. May I see it? He asked, surprising himself with the request. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah unclasped the necklace and handed it to him. The locket was silver, its filigree pattern worn smooth by decades of touch. With careful fingers, Maxwell opened it, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman in a maid's uniform holding an infant. Something about the image struck him as oddly familiar. Where in Newport? He asked, a strange prickling sensation crawling up his spine. The Hamilton estate. It's a museum now, I think. Maxwell stared at the locket, a cold rush of recognition washing over him. "What was your grandmother's name?" "Eleanor. Helena Parker, why?" His hands trembled slightly as he returned the locket. "No reason," he lied, his mind racing. The Hamilton estate had belonged to his grandfather before being donated to the Newport Historical Society. And if Sarah's grandmother had been a maid there during that time period... "It's getting late," Sarah said, checking her watch. "I should catch the last bus." "I'll drive you," Maxwell offered immediately. She hesitated. "That's not necessary." "Please," he insisted, a new urgency in his voice. "It's the least I can do after keeping you out this late." The drive to Sarah's neighborhood was quiet, Maxwell's thoughts churning with possibilities he couldn't yet articulate. Her apartment building was in Riverside, modest but well-maintained, with window boxes of spring flowers defying the urban surroundings. "This is me," she said as he pulled up to the curb. "Thank you for the ride." "Sarah," Maxwell began, then paused, uncertain how to proceed. Would your mother perhaps be willing to speak with me about her time in Newport?" Surprise flickered across Sarah's face. "Why would you be interested in that?" "Professional curiosity," he lied again. "I'm looking at some historical properties for development." Her expression told him she didn't quite believe him, but after a moment she nodded. "Mom has good days and bad days. If you're serious, come by Sunday afternoon. That's usually when she's most alert." "Sunday," he confirmed, his heart racing, with a peculiar mixture of dread and anticipation. As Sarah stepped out of the car, she leaned back in briefly. "Maxwell, whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it." The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. Once home, Maxwell went straight to his study and unlocked a cabinet he rarely opened. Inside was a family album his mother had insisted he keep, a chronicle of the Grant family's rise to prominence through 4 generations. With trembling hands, he turned to a photograph he had seen countless times but never truly examined. His grandfather, Charles Grant, standing proudly in front of the Newport estate with his wife and infant son, Maxwell's father. In the background, barely visible at the edge of the frame, stood a young maid. Maxwell pulled out his phone and magnified the image, his breath catching in his throat. The maid's face, though small and blurred, bore a striking resemblance to the woman in Sarah's locket. Outside his window, the first light of dawn was breaking over Boston Harbor. Maxwell Grant stood perfectly still, the album open in his hands, as pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed began to shift into place. And for the first time in his meticulously controlled life, he had no idea what would happen next. Sunday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of day that coaxes Bostonians into parks and outdoor cafes after a long winter. Maxwell had cancelled 3 meetings and postponed a flight to San Francisco, actions so uncharacteristic that his assistant had asked if he was ill. In a way, perhaps he was, feverish with questions that had consumed him for days. The small bouquet of lilies felt awkward in his hands as he stood outside Sarah's apartment building. He had almost brought an expensive wine before realizing the inappropriateness of such a gift to a recovering stroke patient. The buzzer for apartment 4B seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet Sunday afternoon. "It's open," Sarah called from inside when he knocked. The apartment was nothing like he had imagined, not the cramped, depressing space his privileged mind had conjured, but a warm, sunlit home with walls painted the color of ripe peaches. Books filled every available shelf, plants thrived on windowsills, and photographs covered most surfaces. It was small, certainly, but it held more life than his sprawling penthouse ever had. "You came," Sarah said, appearing from what he presumed was the kitchen. She wore jeans and a simple blue blouse, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. "And you brought flowers. Mom will be thrilled. She loves lilies." "Thank you for having me," Maxwell replied, the formality of his upbringing surfacing in his discomfort. He felt bizarrely out of place in his casual designer clothes that had cost more than most of the furniture in the room. "Mom's having a good day," Sarah continued, taking the flowers. "She's excited to meet you. I haven't seen her this animated in weeks, actually. Though I should warn you, she's quite direct. Stroke patients often lose some social filters. From a room off the main living area came a clear voice, stronger than Maxwell had expected. "Is that him? Bring him in, Sarah. Don't keep the man waiting in the hallway." Eleanor Parker sat in a comfortable armchair by the window, a handmade quilt across her lap despite the warm day. One side of her face showed the telltale droop of stroke damage, but her eyes were sharp and alert, missing nothing as they assessed Maxwell from head to toe. "So you're the millionaire who's been bothering my daughter," she stated without preamble. "Mother," Sarah warned, placing the lilies in a simple vase. "Billionaire, actually," Maxwell replied with unexpected candor, though it's hardly an accomplishment these days. Eleanor's undamaged eyebrow rose, and to his surprise she laughed, a rich sound remarkably similar to her daughter's. Honest and self-deprecating, interesting combination for a man in your position. "Mum taught economics at Parker High before switching to elementary education," Sarah explained, setting the vase on a side table. "She was quite the Wall Street critic in her day." "Still am," Eleanor confirmed, "though I'll admit you're not." "What I expected, Mr. Grant. Sarah said you wanted to know about Newport." Maxwell took the seat Sarah offered across from Eleanor, his heart racing. Up close, the resemblance between the elderly woman and the young maid in the photograph was unmistakable, though separated by decades and circumstances. "Yes," he began, unsure how to navigate this conversation. "I understand your mother worked at the Hamilton estate." "Nearly 40 years, from 1943 until they donated the property in 1982, Eleanor confirmed. "I practically grew up there, helping her dust those ridiculous crystal chandeliers." "The Hamiltons treated their staff well?" Maxwell asked carefully. Eleanor's expression grew more complex. "Better than most of that era. Old Man Hamilton was fair with wages, and Mrs. Hamilton sometimes gave the children of staff her sons' hand-me-downs. But make no mistake, Mr. Grant, there was never any confusion about who was upstairs and who was downstairs." As Eleanor spoke, Maxwell studied her features, searching for any resemblance to his own family. The possibility that had plagued him since seeing the locket seemed both absurd and increasingly plausible. "My records show that Charles Grant was often at the Hamilton estate during the 1950s, Maxwell said, the half-truth coming easily. "They were business partners in several ventures." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, recognition perhaps, or wariness. "Charles Grant was a frequent visitor, yes. Handsome man, ambitious. Married to that Boston socialite. What was her name, Sarah?" "I don't know, Mom," Sarah replied, her gaze now fixed curiously on Maxwell. "Elizabeth," Maxwell supplied. "Elizabeth Cabot Grant. My grandmother." A heavy silence filled the room. Eleanor's gaze never left Maxwell's face, as if she were memorizing every feature. "Why are you really here, Mr. Grant?" she finally asked. "It's not about Newport real estate." The moment of truth had arrived, and Maxwell found himself unprepared despite days of rehearsing this conversation in his mind. "Mrs. Parker, I believe there may be a connection between our families beyond employer and employee." Sarah stood abruptly. "What are you implying exactly?" Eleanor raised a hand to quiet her daughter. "Let him speak, Sarah." Maxwell removed his phone from his pocket and pulled up the photograph he'd digitized from the family album. "This was taken at the Hamilton estate in 1954. That's my grandfather, Charles Grant, with my grandmother and my father as an infant." He zoomed in on the edge of the image, where the young maid stood. "And I believe that's your mother, Mrs. Parker." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she accepted the phone. For a long moment she stared at the image, her expression unreadable. Then she handed the phone to Sarah. "Mom," Sarah's voice held a mixture of confusion and concern. "Mr. Grant," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly tired, "what exactly do you think this proves?" "Nothing definitively," Maxwell admitted, "but I've been researching my family history since I saw your mother's photograph in the locket. Charles Grant made frequent business trips to Newport between 1952 and 1956. Your mother gave birth to you in 1953, and there are financial records, trust payments to an E. Parker from a shell corporation my grandfather controlled, continuing monthly from 1953 until 1990. Sarah's face had gone pale. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Maxwell interrupted. "I'm looking for the truth." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, the weight of decades visible in the slump of her shoulders. When she reopened them, there was a steely resolve that reminded Maxwell of his own reflection. "The truth," she said quietly, "is rarely simple and seldom kind." She gestured to a cabinet near the bookshelves. "Sarah, bring me the blue box from the bottom drawer." Sarah moved woodenly to retrieve it, an old cigar box with faded gold lettering. Eleanor accepted it with reverence, running her fingers over the lid before opening it. Inside lay a collection of letters, their paper yellowed with age, and beneath them a small velvet jewelry box. "Charles Grant was indeed a frequent visitor to the Hamilton estate," Eleanor began, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "He took a particular interest in my mother's welfare after she was widowed. My father, the man I called father, died in a factory accident when I was an infant. Charles arranged for Mom to have the position at the Hamilton estate, which included lodging in the servants' quarters. She removed one of the letters, though she didn't open it. These are from Charles to my mother. I found them after she died. They reveal a relationship that spanned many years, complex, caring, but always secret. He was married, ambitious, climbing Boston's social ladder. She was a widowed maid with a young daughter." Maxwell felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. "Were they in love?" Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Love is a luxury, Mr. Grant. They were human, lonely, flawed. She was grateful for his protection. He found comfort in her lack of pretense." She set the letter aside and opened the velvet box, revealing a sapphire ring. "He gave her this when I was 16. I overheard their conversation that night. He wanted to acknowledge me publicly, to help with my education. She refused, said it would destroy too many lives." Sarah sank into the couch beside her mother, reaching for her hand. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "What was there to tell?" Eleanor asked gently. "That your grandfather might have been a wealthy man who never claimed his daughter, that your grandmother chose dignity over status. These weren't burdens for you to carry, Sarah." Maxwell's mind raced through implications, calculations, possibilities. If Eleanor was indeed his father's half-sister, that would make Sarah his first cousin once removed, Eleanor stated, reading his thoughts with unnerving accuracy. "That's the relationship, if what I suspect is true." "We could do a DNA test," Maxwell suggested, his businessman's mind seeking concrete evidence. "To what end?" Eleanor challenged. "Money? Legal claims? What exactly are you hoping to find here, Mr. Grant?" The question struck Maxwell like a physical blow. What was he seeking? Confirmation of a family scandal? New heirs to the Grant fortune? Or something more fundamental? A connection to fill the emptiness that wealth had never touched? "I don't know," he admitted, echoing his words from the late-night cafe. "I just know that when I saw Sarah, something felt familiar, like I was supposed to meet her." Sarah had been silent, processing the revelation with a nurse's analytical mind and a daughter's emotional stake. Now she looked directly at Maxwell, her expression a complex mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "If what you're suggesting is true," she said slowly, "why come forward now? Why not leave the past buried?" It was a fair question, one Maxwell had asked himself repeatedly over sleepless nights. The answer came with surprising clarity. "Because I'm tired of living in a world built on appearances and convenient truths," he said. "Because for the first time in years I felt something real when we spoke in that diner." He paused, gathering courage for the most honest words he'd spoken in decades. "And because I've been collecting possessions my entire life, when what I might really want is family." Eleanor studied him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to strip away pretense. Then she nodded once, decisively. "Sarah, would you make some tea? I think this conversation requires it." It was a dismissal, a moment requested alone with Maxwell. As Sarah reluctantly left for the kitchen, Eleanor leaned forward. "Listen carefully, Mr. Grant. I don't know if Charles was my biological father. My mother took that secret to her grave. But I do know this. If you're playing some game with my daughter, using this family history speculation to manipulate her for whatever reason, there isn't enough money in your empire to protect you from my wrath. Stroke or no stroke. The fierceness of her protection reminded Maxwell painfully of his own mother, not the society matron she'd become, but the younger woman who had once threatened his third-grade teacher for suggesting he wasn't Grant material. I swear to you, Mrs. Parker, my intentions are genuine. Eleanor held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded almost imperceptibly. Then perhaps it's time we all learned the truth. But this happens on our terms, not yours. No lawyers, no press, no Grant family drama. Just three people trying to understand their shared history. Agreed? Agreed, Maxwell promised, just as Sarah returned with a tray of mismatched teacups. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows of the modest apartment, Maxwell Grant, master of mergers and acquisitions, found himself negotiating the most important deal of his life. And for once, the terms had nothing to do with profit. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered in an innocuous envelope to Maxwell's office. For 20 minutes, he sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the unopened package, while his assistant's voice periodically crackled through the intercom with reminders of pending calls and meetings. Cancel everything, he finally instructed. The rest of today and tomorrow. Sir? The surprise in her voice was evident. In 15 years, Maxwell Grant had never cancelled a full day of appointments, not even when he'd contracted pneumonia 3 years ago. Family emergency, he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. And have Charles bring the car around. The drive to Riverside took longer than usual. Boston traffic snarled by an accident on the Tobin Bridge. Maxwell barely noticed, his mind replaying fragments of conversations from the past 3 weeks. Sarah's carefully guarded optimism about the test, Eleanor's practical warnings not to expect too much, his own tangled emotions that vacillated between hope and terror. They had agreed to open the results together, a pact made over teacups in Sarah's apartment that now seemed both quaint and profound. Yet Maxwell had broken that promise, requesting a preliminary copy be sent directly to him. The weight of that betrayal sat heavily in his breast pocket, where the unopened envelope pressed against his heart like an accusation. When he arrived at Sarah's building, she was waiting outside, still in her scrubs from a day shift at the E hospital. Her expression shifted from surprise to concern when she saw his face. "You know already, don't you?" she asked without preamble. The directness that had first drawn him to her now left him nowhere to hide. "No," he admitted. "I requested a copy, but I haven't opened it. I couldn't do it alone." Something in Sarah's face softened. "Come inside. Mom's resting, but she'll want to be part of this." Eleanor was indeed resting, but her eyes opened immediately when they entered the apartment, sharp and alert as ever. "How you brought the verdict, I see," she observed, nodding toward the envelope in Maxwell's hand. "I thought we should do this together," he said, placing it on the coffee table between them. "Well, don't just stand there looking like you're facing a firing squad," Eleanor instructed. "Open it." With hands that betrayed a slight tremor, Maxwell broke the seal and extracted the papers. The clinical language of genetic probability swam before his eyes, but the conclusion stood in stark relief: a 99.8% likelihood of a first cousin once removed relationship between Maxwell Grant and Sarah Parker. "It's true then," Sarah whispered, reading over his shoulder. "Your grandfather was my grandfather, and your mother was my father's half-sister," Maxwell added, the reality of it settling into his bones with surprising weight. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, decades of questions seemed to have found their answer. "So, Mother's secret wasn't a secret after all," she murmured. "Charles knew, he must have. Other payments to your mother," Maxwell realized. "They weren't hush money, they were family support," Eleanor finished. In his own limited way, he was acknowledging his responsibility. A complex silence filled the room as three people absorbed the implications of shared blood, of a family tree split and now reconnected across generations of separation. It was Sarah who finally broke it. "So what now?" she asked. Are we supposed to become one big happy family? Exchange Christmas, cards and vacation photos? The question held no malice, only genuine uncertainty. Maxwell found himself equally adrift. His entire life had been built on clear objectives and measured outcomes. This situation offered neither. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never been so very good at family, even with the relatives I already knew I had." Eleanor shifted in her chair, wincing slightly at what must have been pain from her condition. "Perhaps we start by addressing why this matters so much to you, Maxwell. Finding long-lost relatives isn't typically a billionaire's hobby." The gentle provocation was exactly what Maxwell needed, permission to vocalize the thoughts that had been churning since that rainy day on the bench. He moved to the window, looking out at the modest street below where children played in the late afternoon sunshine. "My father died 10 years ago," he began. "Heart attack on the golf course, quite sudden. My mother followed 3 years later, cancer. I have distant cousins, business associates, people who want things from me, but no one who," he struggled to find the words, "no one who simply knows me." Sarah studied him with the assessing gaze she likely used with difficult patients. "And you think we could provide that? People you've known for less than a month?" "I think," Maxwell said carefully, "that when we met, you saw something in me that most people miss. You saw past the wealth and the position to the emptiness underneath. And I've spent every day since wondering what it would be like to be known that way all the time." The raw honesty hung in the air between them. Sarah's expression softened, while Eleanor watched them both with the knowing eyes of someone who had seen too many human dramas unfold. "Well," Eleanor finally said, breaking the tension, "at my age, I don't have time for slow, cautious relationships. If you're family, then you're family. But there are conditions." Maxwell turned from the window. "Name them." "First, no grand gestures. No buying buildings or businesses, or whatever it is billionaires do when they're feeling emotional." A smile tugged at Maxwell's lips. "Agreed." "Second, this stays between us until we decide otherwise. I won't have Sarah hounded by reporters or gossips." "Of course." "And third," Eleanor's voice softened slightly, "Sunday dinners. Here, every week you're in town." The simplicity of the request caught Maxwell off guard. For a moment, he was transported back to childhood memories. Rare Sunday afternoons when his father wasn't working, when his mother would dismiss the staff and make her special roast chicken. Before the IPO, before the mansions and jets, before the Grant name became synonymous with wealth rather than family. "I'd like that," he said quietly. The moment was interrupted by Sarah's phone. She glanced at it, her expression instantly shifting to professional concern. "It's the hospital. I need to take this." As she stepped into the kitchen to answer, Eleanor beckoned Maxwell closer. "She works too hard," she said in a lowered voice. "Always has. Takes after her grandmother that way." "The geriatric unit is understaffed," Maxwell replied, recalling details from their coffee shop conversations. "They've been cutting positions due to budget issues." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "And how would you know about hospital budgets, Mr. Grant?" Before he could answer, Sarah returned, her face pale with anger or shock, perhaps both. "They're closing our unit," she announced, hands trembling slightly. 90 days notice. They're consolidating geriatric care with general medicine to cut costs. "What about your patients?" Eleanor asked. "Transferred or discharged? And the staff?" Sarah ran a hand through her hair. "Half of us will be offered positions elsewhere in the system. The rest—" "Let me help," Maxwell said instinctively. Sarah's expression hardened. "This isn't a problem you can throw money at, Maxwell. This is systemic. Healthcare being treated as a business rather than a service. Writing a check won't fix that." "I'm not talking about writing a check," he countered. "Grant Medical Technologies owns a controlling interest in 3 hospitals in Greater Boston. I have influence." "More corporate healthcare is exactly what we don't need," Sarah interrupted. "Do you know what happens when profit drives medical decisions? My patients get 15 minutes of doctor time instead of 30. Their medications get switched to cheaper alternatives regardless of side effects. They get pushed out of beds as soon as insurance stops paying, even if they're not ready. The passion in her voice struck Maxwell with unexpected force. This wasn't theoretical for her. These were people she cared for daily, whose hands she held, whose dignity she protected. "Then tell me what would help," he said quietly. "Not as a grant, but as family. What would actually make a difference?" The question hung between them. Sarah looked at him with genuine surprise, as if the idea that he might listen rather than dictate was novel. She sank onto the couch, the weight of the day's revelations, both personal and professional, visible in the slump of her shoulders. "A community-based approach," she finally said. "Geriatric care that's integrated with social services, mental health support, physical therapy. A place where elderly patients aren't just medical cases to be processed, but people with stories and dignity and needs beyond the purely physical." As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, revealing a vision clearly long held but rarely articulated. Maxwell listened with growing interest, his mind automatically calculating costs, logistics, potential structures. It would never be profitable. "Enough for the healthcare conglomerates," Sarah concluded with a resigned shrug, "which is why it remains a dream." Eleanor watched them both, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes dreams and pragmatism need to meet," she observed. "Sarah has the vision. Maxwell has the resources. Perhaps that's not coincidence." Maxwell considered her words. All his life he had used his wealth and influence to acquire, to control, to expand his empire. What would it mean to use those same tools to build something whose value couldn't be measured in quarterly reports? "I need to make a call," he said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "May I use your balcony?" Sarah nodded, still processing the multiple shocks of the afternoon. Maxwell stepped outside to the small balcony with its potted herbs and single folding chair. From his pocket, he pulled not his regular phone, but a second one, a secure line used only for his most confidential business dealings. "James, it's me," he said when his CFO answered. "I need you to gather some information quietly. Boston General Hospital Geriatric Unit, staffing, budget, patient outcomes, and I want to know who sits on their board." "Acquisition target?" James asked, the excitement of a potential deal evident in his voice. Maxwell watched through the glass as Sarah knelt beside her. "Mother," their heads close together in worried conversation. "No," he replied. "Something different. Something that matters." When he returned inside, Sarah was preparing tea, a ritual he'd noticed she performed when gathering her thoughts. Eleanor had dozed off in her chair, the emotional toll of the day's revelations evident in her exhausted features. "I've been thinking about what you said," Maxwell began, keeping his voice low. "About community-based care." Sarah glanced up, wariness in her eyes. "It was just talk. The reality is, I need to update my resume and start looking for a new position." What if there was another option? He chose his words carefully, aware that her pride was as strong as his own. Not charity, not a blank check, a partnership. What kind of partnership? "One where your expertise guides the structure, and my resources provide the foundation." He paused, sensing her hesitation. "I've spent my life building things that make money. Maybe it's time to build something that makes a difference." Sarah set down the teapot, studying him with those direct eyes that seemed to see past his carefully constructed facades. "Why would you do that? Because we share some DNA?" "No," Maxwell answered honestly. "Because when you spoke about your patients, I heard something I've been missing in my own life: purpose. You know what they need because you care enough to ask, to listen, to see them as people, not problems." He stepped closer, aware that this moment felt pivotal in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "I'm not offering to solve your problem, Sarah. I'm asking if we might solve it together." Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance, not yet, but the beginning of consideration. Outside the window, the afternoon light had softened to early evening, casting long shadows across the modest apartment. In the corner, Eleanor's breathing had deepened into gentle snores, her face relaxed in sleep. "She deserves better than what our current system offers," Sarah said softly, looking at her mother. "They all do." "Yes," Maxwell agreed simply. They do. Sarah took a deep breath, then met his gaze with characteristic directness. If, and it's a big if, we were to explore this, it would be an equal partnership. No corporate takeovers, no Maxwell Grant swooping in to save the day. My expertise would matter as much as your money, agreed, he said without hesitation. And it would be about the care, not the publicity or tax write-offs or whatever other benefits you might get. Of course. Sarah nodded slowly, a tentative decision forming. Then I suppose we should talk. As they settled at the small kitchen table with their teacups, Maxwell felt a strange sense of homecoming, as if the emptiness he had carried for so long might finally have found its purpose. Outside, the first stars appeared in the Boston sky, witnesses to an unexpected alliance formed of shared blood and separate dreams, now converging. The Grant name had adorned buildings, letterheads, and charity galas throughout Boston for generations. It had never, however, appeared on a nurse's ID badge until today. Maxwell watched from the back of the conference room as Sarah pinned her new credentials to her lab coat. Sarah Parker, RN, Director of Patient Services, Grant Parker Elder. Care Initiative. 3 months of intensive planning had brought them to this moment. The former retail space, a failed department store in a struggling mall on the edge of Riverside, had been transformed into a bright, welcoming facility with examination rooms, therapy spaces, social areas, and gardens visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Today was the open house for staff and patients transferring from Boston General's closing geriatric unit. "You're hovering," observed Victoria Winters, appearing at his elbow with her characteristic stealth. As his chief investment officer and longest-serving executive, she was one of the few people who could speak to him with such bluntness. "I'm observing," Maxwell corrected, keeping his voice low. "There's a difference." Victoria followed his gaze to where Sarah was introducing herself to their newly hired physicians. "She's quite remarkable," Victoria noted. "Not at all what I expected when you said you were partnering with a nurse on a healthcare venture." There was a question beneath her statement, one of many Victoria had carefully not asked over recent months. Maxwell had offered no explanation for his sudden interest in geriatric care, nor for the partnership with someone completely outside their usual business circles. The board had nearly revolted when he'd announced he was diverting $40 million from their technology fund to establish what they derisively called the Nursing Home Project. Only James, his CFO, knew about the DNA test, and even he didn't understand the full significance of what had transpired in Sarah's apartment that Tuesday afternoon. Some truths weren't meant for board meetings or executive summaries. Sarah understands what these patients need because she spent years actually listening to them, Maxwell said, something our healthcare acquisitions team has notably failed to do. Victoria raised an eyebrow at his tone, but wisely changed the subject. "The press is starting to arrive. Are you sure you don't want to be part of the official announcement? It would go a long way with the board." "No," Maxwell replied firmly. "This is her project. I'm just the financial partner." Victoria's skeptical expression made it clear she wasn't buying his attempt at modesty. "Maxwell Grant, silent partner? That's certainly a first." She checked her watch. "I have to get back downtown for the Nakamura meeting. Are you still planning to dial in?" "I'll be there," he assured her, though the Japanese investment that would have consumed his full attention 3 months ago now seemed like a distant concern. As Victoria departed, Maxwell circulated through the growing crowd, intentionally, staying on the periphery. He recognized most of the nurses and aides from Boston General. Sarah had insisted on bringing her entire team, not just the ones with the most impressive credentials. Several patients had already arrived as well, elderly men and women who would form the core of their initial care group. Near the refreshment table, he spotted Eleanor in her wheelchair, holding court with several seniors who appeared captivated by whatever story she was telling. Her health had stabilized over the past months, partly due to a new specialist Maxwell had quietly arranged to consult on her case. Their Sunday dinners had become a fixture in his calendar, the one appointment his assistant knew never to reschedule. "Mr. Grant?" Maxwell turned to find a young man in a Boston Globe press lanyard extending his hand. "Jason Chen," Boston Globe. Could I get a few quotes about your involvement in this initiative? It's quite a departure from your usual investments. I'm afraid I'm not the person you should be speaking with, Maxwell replied smoothly. Sarah Parker is the driving force behind this project. She's the one with the vision. The reporter glanced toward Sarah, then back at Maxwell with poorly concealed skepticism. But Grant Ventures provided the funding, correct? Nearly $40 million according to our sources. That's a significant charitable contribution, even for someone of your wealth. It's not charity, Maxwell corrected, an edge entering his voice. It's a partnership. And if you want to understand why it matters, I suggest you speak with the patients and staff who will be using this facility. Before the reporter could press further, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A group of executives in expensive suits had arrived, led by a silver-haired man Maxwell instantly recognized. Richard Calloway, CEO of Integrated Health Systems, the corporate giant that had recently acquired Boston General. "Excuse me," Maxwell said to the reporter, moving swiftly across the room. He intercepted Calloway before he could reach Sarah, who was now greeting arriving patients. "Richard," Maxwell extended his hand with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I wasn't aware you'd be joining us today." Calloway's handshake was firm to the point of aggression. "Maxwell, quite a project you've undertaken here. When I heard Grant Ventures was behind the facility poaching our geriatric staff, I had to see for myself." "We didn't poach anyone," Maxwell replied evenly. "You closed an essential department. We simply provided an alternative." Calloway's smile thinned. "Let's not play games. This facility is operating at a loss from day one. What's your angle?" "Tax write-off. PR moved to soften your image before the Sherman Pharmaceuticals takeover." The reference to Maxwell's pending acquisition, a hostile takeover still in its confidential stages, sent a chill of suspicion through him. Either his team had a leak, or Calloway had sources Maxwell hadn't identified. "No angle," Maxwell said, keeping his tone neutral despite his internal alarm. "Sometimes a good idea is just a good idea." Calloway laughed, the sound utterly devoid of humor. "We've known each other too long for that, Max. Nobody in our position does anything without multiple objectives." He glanced around the facility, his gaze dismissive. "Though I must say, if you wanted to diversify into healthcare, there are far more profitable sectors than geriatrics." "Not everything is about profit margins, Richard," says the man who gutted Robinson Technologies last quarter and laid off 300 people to improve his EBITDA by 2 points. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "What's really going on here, Maxwell? First you withdraw from the Cambridge Research Corridor bid, then you pull out of the Singapore expansion, and now you're throwing millions at a glorified nursing home. The street is starting to talk." The implied threat wasn't subtle. In their world, "the street is talking" was the first warning sign before investors began to lose confidence. "The street can talk all at once," Maxwell replied coldly. "My investment decisions aren't up for public debate." Calloway stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I heard an interesting rumor about that nurse you've partnered with. Sarah Parker, is it? Something about a personal connection. Very personal." Maxwell's carefully maintained composure nearly shattered. How could Calloway possibly know about the DNA test? The results had been handled with absolute confidentiality, the samples submitted under aliases. "Careful, Richard," Maxwell warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch. "Spreading unfounded rumors about my associates could prove costly." Calloway held his gaze for a long moment, then stepped back with a practiced smile as a photographer approached. "Just looking out for an old friend," he said, voice raised for potential listeners. "Impressive facility you've built here. Integrated Health would be interested in discussing potential synergies should you ever consider scaling the model." With that, he moved away to join a group of local politicians who had arrived for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Maxwell remained frozen in place, mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. If Calloway suspected the truth about his connection to Sarah, others might too. The carefully constructed narrative they'd built around their partnership could unravel, exposing Sarah and Eleanor to exactly the kind of public scrutiny they'd wanted to avoid. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah commented, appearing beside him with a tray of champagne glasses for the toast. "Everything okay?" Maxwell composed his features. Fine. Just some corporate posturing from Richard Calloway. Sarah's expression darkened. The man who shut down our unit at Boston General. What's he doing here? Reconnaissance, Maxwell replied honestly. He's trying to figure out our angle. Our angle is providing quality care to elderly patients, Sarah said firmly. There's nothing complicated about it. If only that were true, Maxwell thought. The reality was infinitely more complex. A web of personal connection, professional ambition, and something deeper he wasn't yet ready to name, even to himself. Before he could respond, feedback from a microphone drew their attention to the center of the room, where Eleanor was being positioned near a ceremonial ribbon. Though they had agreed Sarah would make the official announcement, Eleanor had insisted on saying a few words as their elder representative. "Welcome, everyone," Eleanor began, her voice strong despite her frail appearance. "I won't keep you long. At my age, time becomes increasingly precious." A ripple of appreciative laughter moved through the crowd. "I'm here today not just as a potential patient of this wonderful new facility, but as someone who has spent a lifetime watching how our society treats its elders." Maxwell moved closer, wanting to hear every word. Sarah remained at his side, her expression a mixture of pride and concern for her mother. "There was a time," Eleanor continued, "when the wisdom of age was valued, when elders were consulted and respected for their life experience. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We began warehousing our seniors, treating them as problems to be managed rather than people to be honored." The room had grown quiet, even the reporters and photographers stilling their movements to listen. What makes the Grant Parker Initiative different isn't just the beautiful building or the excellent staff, though. We certainly have both. Eleanor's gaze found Maxwell in the crowd, her eyes communicating a depth of meaning known only to them. What makes it different is the recognition that worth isn't measured by productivity or profit, that every life has value, every story matters, and every person deserves dignity, especially in their final chapters. Maxwell felt something tighten in his chest. Across the room, he noticed Richard Calloway watching with calculating eyes, probably wondering how to spin this in tomorrow's business pages. "I've seen what happens when we reduce people to numbers on a spreadsheet," Eleanor continued, and Maxwell wondered if her words were partly meant for him. "I've also seen what happens when we recognize the humanity in each other, the connections that transcend circumstance, the bridges built across divides of age and class and background." She gestured toward Sarah. "My daughter has always understood this. She spent her career fighting for patients that our healthcare system often overlooks. Today, thanks to an unexpected partnership, her vision has a home." Eleanor's gaze returned to Maxwell, and he saw in her eyes the same penetrating insight that had disarmed him at their first meeting. Sometimes the most important connections in our lives come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the family we need isn't the one we were born into, but the one we discover along the way. A murmur ran through the crowd at these words. Maxwell saw the Globe reporter scribbling furiously, while Calloway's expression sharpened with interest. "So as we open this facility today," Eleanor concluded, "let's remember that it represents more than just a place for medical care. It represents what's possible when we recognize each other's humanity, when we see beyond surface differences to the shared values beneath." The applause was immediate and heartfelt. As Sarah moved forward to cut the ribbon with her mother, Maxwell remained where he was, Eleanor's words resonating through him with uncomfortable clarity. "Family we discover along the way." The phrase seemed to illuminate something he'd been avoiding acknowledging, that his interest in the Parker women had evolved beyond curiosity about genetic connections or even the appeal of a meaningful project. Somewhere in the Sunday dinners and late-night planning sessions, in Eleanor's blunt wisdom and Sarah's passionate advocacy, he had found something he'd never expected. People who mattered to him more than his next acquisition or stock valuation. The realization was terrifying. "Mr. Grant?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find one of Sarah's former patients from Boston General, an elderly woman with bright eyes and twisted arthritic hands. "I just wanted to thank you. My daughter lives in Riverside, but I couldn't afford the private facilities nearby. Now I can see her 3 times a week instead of once a month." "You should thank Sarah," Maxwell deflected automatically. This was her vision. The woman smiled knowingly. "I already did. But it takes more than vision to build something like this. It takes someone willing to listen." She patted his arm with her gnarled hand. "Not many people in your position would have heard what she was really saying." As the woman moved away, Maxwell caught sight of Calloway on his phone, gesturing animatedly, while staring directly at him. Across the room, Sarah was now showing a group of doctors the therapy gardens, her face alight with the passion that had first caught his attention in that rainy diner. He had built his empire by making calculated decisions, by never allowing emotion to cloud his judgment. Yet here he stood, financially committed to a project that would never generate profit, personally entangled with people who knew his most carefully guarded secrets, professionally vulnerable to questions he couldn't answer truthfully. And for the first time in his adult life, Maxwell Grant had no contingency plan. His phone buzzed, a text from James. "Nakamura meeting starting. Are you dialing in?" Maxwell stared at the message, then at Sarah across the room. In his old life, he would have already been on the call, closing the deal that would add another $100 million to the Grant Ventures portfolio. Now, he found himself weighing something far less quantifiable against that familiar imperative. He typed a quick response, "Handle it, I trust your judgment." As he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Maxwell made his way towards Sarah, aware that Richard Calloway was still watching his every move. The path ahead was unclear, fraught with complications he couldn't yet foresee, but for perhaps the first time in his life, he was following something other than the cold calculation of profit and loss. And that, more than anything, terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. A year had passed since the Grant Parker Elder Care Initiative opened its doors. Winter had given way to spring, then summer, fall and winter again. Now, as the Boston snow melted into the first tentative blooms of a new April, Maxwell Grant stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the city awaken beneath him. His reflection in the glass was subtly changed from the man who had once sat drenched on a park bench. The severe lines of his face had softened, and though silver now threaded more prominently at his temples, there was a clarity in his eyes that expensive tailoring and power ties had never provided. "Sir, the car is ready," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "And Ms. Winters has sent the revised proposal for the board meeting this afternoon." "Thank you, Jessica," Maxwell replied, collecting his coat, not the custom cashmere he would have worn to the office, but a more practical wool jacket suitable for the community garden he would be visiting first. The Grant Ventures board meeting would be contentious today. His decision to transfer 30% of his voting shares into the newly established Grant Family Foundation had sent shockwaves through the financial community. The business press had been ruthless. Grant losing his edge? Empire in decline? Billionaire's midlife crisis threatens shareholder value. None of it mattered as much as it once would have. The Bentley glided through morning traffic toward Riverside, a route Charles now knew by heart. Maxwell had sold the private jet 6 months ago, cancelled the Aspen Chalet renovation, and declined to renew his membership at 3 exclusive clubs. Each decision had fueled further speculation about his stability or health, rumors he neither confirmed nor denied. The truth was both simpler and more complex than the financial analysts could understand. Some transformations couldn't be captured in quarterly reports or investor presentations. The car pulled up to the newly expanded Grant Parker facility, where the promised community garden had blossomed from concept to reality. What had once been a barren parking lot was now sectioned into raised garden beds, wheelchair-accessible pathways and shaded sitting areas. Several patients were already at work despite the early hour, assisted by staff and volunteers. "Good. Morning, Mr. Grant," called Mrs. Abernathy, the spirited octogenarian who had appointed herself head gardener. Her arthritic hands were covered in soil-stained gloves as she supervised the planting of spring seedlings. "We've saved the tomato section for you." Maxwell smiled, genuinely pleased by the simple recognition. "I'll be right there." Inside, the facility hummed with morning activity. What had begun as a simple geriatric care center had evolved over the year, adding rehabilitation services, a memory care unit, and most recently, an intergenerational program that brought local school children to interact with the seniors. The Yata expansion hadn't come without challenges. Richard Calloway had made good on his implied threats, launching an aggressive investigation into Maxwell's sudden interest in healthcare. The business press had speculated wildly about Maxwell's connection to Sarah, ranging from romantic entanglement to corporate espionage. Through it all, they had maintained their agreed-upon narrative: a chance meeting, a shared vision, a business partnership. Only in private, during their now sacred Sunday dinners, did they acknowledge the deeper truth that bound them. Maxwell found Sarah in her office, surrounded by patient files and the remains of what appeared to be breakfast, eaten hastily at her desk. She looked up as he entered, her smile warming her tired eyes. "You're early," she observed, glancing at the clock. "The board presentation isn't until 3. "I thought I'd get my hands dirty before putting on the corporate armor," he replied. "Mrs. Abernathy has reserved the tomato beds for me." Sarah laughed, a sound Maxwell had come to treasure. "She's convinced you have a special touch with them. Last year's crop was impressive." "Beginner's luck," Maxwell demurred, though he secretly took pride in the thriving plants he had tended. Never in his previous life would he have imagined finding satisfaction in such simple growth. Sarah set aside her paperwork. "How are you feeling about the board meeting?" Maxwell shrugged. "They'll adjust, they always do when the numbers work." He paused, then added more honestly, "Though this time the numbers aren't the point." The Grant Family Foundation had been formally announced the previous month, with an initial endowment of $2 billion, a significant portion of Maxwell's personal wealth. Its mission encompassed elder care, medical research focused on age-related diseases, and community support programs. Eleanor had been named honorary chairperson, though her health prevented active participation. "Mum's having a good morning," Sarah said as if reading his thoughts. "The new medication seems to be helping. She asked if you'd stop by before you left for downtown." Maxwell nodded, grateful for the update. Eleanor's health had declined over the winter, a series of minor strokes further limiting her mobility. The doctor's prognosis wasn't optimistic, a reality they all acknowledged in their different ways. "I brought the papers she asked for," he said, patting his jacket pocket, "though I still think she should reconsider." Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "You know, Mom, once she makes up her mind, that's it." Eleanor had recently insisted on formalizing her role in the family foundation, despite her health limitations. More surprising was her request to be publicly acknowledged as a Grant relative, a step Maxwell and Sarah had been hesitant to take, given the media attention it would certainly bring. "She deserves to claim her place in the family," Maxwell conceded. "I just worry about the circus it might create." "We've handled worse," Sarah reminded him, "and it matters to her to have the truth acknowledged while she's still here to see it." Maxwell nodded, understanding the unspoken urgency. Eleanor's time was growing short, a reality they all faced with the clear-eyed acceptance she had taught them. "I'll see her after my gardening duty," he promised, turning to leave. "Save me a sandwich from your lunch order. The board meetings never have decent food." "Already planned to," Sarah replied. "Good luck with the tomatoes." Outside in the garden, Maxwell removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, enjoying the feel of spring sunshine on his face. Mrs. Abernathy supervised his work with good-natured criticism, instructing him on the proper depth for each seedling. Around them, other patients worked at their own plots or rested on benches, watching the activity with contented interest. "You're different than you were a year ago," Mrs. Abernathy observed, never one to mince words. "Less stiff, more human." Maxwell smiled at her characteristic bluntness. "I suppose I am." "Sarah's good for you," the elderly woman continued, patting down soil around a fragile seedling. "You're good for her too. She smiles more now." Maxwell's hands stilled momentarily. His relationship with Sarah had evolved over the year into something neither of them had names for. Deeper than friendship, more complex than family obligation, undefined, yet essential to them both. "We're partners," he said simply, the same explanation he'd given countless reporters. Mrs. Abernathy snorted, clearly unimpressed with his answer. "Partners, family, friends, you young people always need labels. At my age, you learn what matters is who shows up, who stays when things get hard." She fixed him with her keen gaze. "You've shown up, Mr. Grant. That counts for something." The eye. Observation stayed with him as he finished the planting, then made his way to Eleanor's private room in the facility's residential wing. They had renovated it extensively to accommodate her needs, creating a space that reflected her personality. Bookshelves filled with dog-eared classics, walls adorned with family photographs, windows overlooking the garden she could no longer tend herself. Eleanor was awake and alert, propped up in a reclining chair by the window. Despite the ravages of illness, her eyes remained sharp and observant as Maxwell entered. "There's the prodigal Grant," she greeted him, her smile lifting the drooping side of her face. "Come to visit the poor relation before your big board showdown?" Maxwell leaned down to kiss her cheek, long past the formality that had marked their early interactions. "I brought the foundation papers you asked for, though I still think you could wait until after I'm gone," Eleanor finished bluntly. "No, thank you. I want to see this through." She gestured to the chair beside her. "Sit. We need to talk." Maxwell complied, recognizing the tone that brooked no argument. Eleanor might be physically diminished, but her will remained indomitable. "I spoke with your lawyers yesterday," she began, surprising him. "Finalized my statement for the press release." "You didn't need to do that alone," Maxwell said, concern creasing his brow. "Sarah or I would have been there." Eleanor waved away his worry. "I'm perfectly capable of speaking for myself. Besides, there are some things a woman needs to say in her own words." She fixed him with that penetrating gaze that always made him feel transparent, including this: "You need to stop hiding." "I'm not hiding," Maxwell protested. "I've been more public this past year than ever before." "Not about your business," Eleanor clarified, "about what really matters." She reached for a photograph on the side table, a candid shot of Maxwell and Sarah taken at the facility's 6-month celebration. In it, they were caught in a moment of shared laughter, unaware of the camera. "About this." Maxwell felt heat rise to his face. "Sarah and I are complicated, family, business partners," Eleanor supplied, her tone gently mocking. "Yes, you've said repeatedly, and it's all true, which makes it the perfect shield." "Shield against what?" Maxwell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Against the risk of being truly known," Eleanor replied softly. "Against the vulnerability of admitting what she's come to mean to you." The words hung in the air between them, undeniable in their accuracy. Maxwell had built his life around calculated risks, but the prospect of acknowledging his feelings for Sarah terrified him in ways no business venture ever had. "The genetic connection complicates things," he said finally. Eleanor laughed outright. "First cousins once removed. That's your excuse, please. Half the aristocracy of Europe is more closely related." Her expression softened. "The real complication is fear, Maxwell. Fear that she might not feel the same way. Fear that you might have to experience actual rejection, rather than the controlled distance you've maintained your whole life." Her words struck with uncanny precision, targeting vulnerabilities he had scarcely acknowledged to himself. "I've never been very good at personal relationships," he admitted. "My track record speaks for itself." "Because you've always had one foot out the door," Eleanor observed. "Ready to retreat to the safety of your empire at the first sign of emotional risk." She gestured to the window where Sarah could be seen walking through the garden, stopping to speak with each patient. "But she's worth the risk, don't you think?" Before Maxwell could respond, a soft knock at the door announced Sarah's arrival. She entered carrying a small bag that emanated the aromas of fresh coffee and baked goods. "I thought we could have a proper breakfast before your meeting," she explained, setting up the impromptu meal on the small table. "Mum, I brought those almond croissants you like." As Sarah busied herself with the food, Eleanor caught Maxwell's eye, her expression eloquent with unspoken meaning. "Life is short," that look seemed to say. "Don't waste what time you have." The three of them shared the meal with the easy familiarity that had developed over countless Sunday dinners. They discussed the Foundation's upcoming initiatives, Eleanor's latest physical therapy accomplishments, and the promising results from the intergenerational program. Not once did they mention the board meeting or the impending public announcement about their familial connection. Some truths didn't need constant articulation to be real. Too soon, Maxwell's phone buzzed with a reminder. "I should head downtown," he said reluctantly. "The board likes when I at least pretend to prepare before presenting radical restructuring plans." Eleanor nodded regally from her chair. "Go change the world, or at least your small corner of it. We'll be here when you return." The simple assurance warmed him more than he could express. As he stood to leave, Sarah rose as well. "I'll walk you out," she offered. In the hallway, away from Eleanor's knowing gaze, a comfortable silence fell between them. Sarah looked particularly lovely today, in a simple blouse and trousers, her hair pulled back in its practical style. Maxwell found himself noticing the small details, the tiny creases at the corners of her eyes when she smiled, the single freckle near her temple, the graceful efficiency of her movements. "You'll do. Fine today," she said as they reached the entrance. "The board may bluster, but they know better than to seriously challenge you." "It's not the board I'm concerned about," Maxwell replied honestly. Sarah tilted her head questioningly. "What then?" Maxwell hesitated, Eleanor's words echoing in his mind. Take the risk. After a lifetime of calculated moves, could he make one based purely on what his heart had come to know? When this is all over, the announcement, the press coverage, the inevitable questions, I was hoping we might take some time away, just us. The words came out more formally than he had intended, but Sarah's expression softened with understanding. "Away? From the foundations and facilities and board meetings?" she asked. "Away from everything except what matters," Maxwell clarified, reaching for her hand, a gesture that had become familiar over the months but now carried new weight. "There are things I need to say to you, Sarah, things that have nothing to do with shared DNA or business partnerships." Something shifted in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or hope. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. For a moment, they stood there, hands linked, the unspoken hovering between them like a promise waiting to be claimed. Then Sarah rose on tiptoes and kissed his cheek, a gesture so simple yet so profound that Maxwell felt it resonate through his entire being. "Go show them who you've become," she whispered. "The rest will wait." As Maxwell drove toward downtown, Boston, the city spread before him in the spring sunshine. The skyscrapers that had once been the markers of his success now seemed like mere buildings, impressive, but ultimately just glass and steel. The true architecture of a meaningful life, he had come to understand, was built of different materials entirely: trust, vulnerability, connection, purpose. The board meeting would be difficult. The press conference afterward, announcing both, the Foundation's expanded mission and Eleanor's place in the Grant family, would generate headlines for weeks. The path ahead held challenges he couldn't yet foresee. Yet for the first time in his life, Maxwell Grant was not navigating by the cold calculations of profit and risk. Instead, he was following the compass of what he knew to be true, that in the most unexpected circumstances, he had found not just family, but home. Not just purpose, but meaning. Not just success, but fulfillment. And in the woman who had once offered an umbrella to a drenched stranger, he had found the courage to become the man he was always meant to be. As the Bentley approached the gleaming tower of Grant Ventures headquarters, Maxwell straightened his tie and prepared to face the board. Whatever happened in that conference room, he would return to Riverside by evening, to the garden where his tomatoes were taking root, to Eleanor's wit and wisdom, to Sarah, and all the unspoken possibilities that awaited them. Some transformations couldn't be captured in quarterly reports or investor presentations. But they were, Maxwell now understood, the only ones that truly mattered in the end.